I bought a printer. It's so I have scripts in my hand now, so I don't have to try and fucking memorize everything I say in these goddamn videos. Have you ever been to a fair? Like a state fair, like a place where you get a fried Snickers and hop on Injury Lawsuit the ride. Well, what if I told you the concept of a fair wasn't always the trailer park joke it's known for in America today? I mean, yes, historically, there's always been a local dinky fair where you buy knickknacks and try and avoid people you knew from high school. But back in the day, we used to have these cool-ass things known as the World's Fair. These World's Fairs were a hub of technological and social innovation, inviting the top minds of their time to come together and show off their inventions. Now, for most Americans, the concept of a World's Fair seems like a long-forgotten relic of the past. The US hasn't hosted a World's Fair this century, so like the closest an American's gonna get to seeing one is spending a weekend at Epcot. Which, by the way, Epcot was supposed to be a utopian city with 20,000 people, and that idea Disney got from going to a World's Fair, but we don't have time to go into that. But this blend of optimism, innovation, and utopian vision that these fairs were known for is just the thin veil that is placed over an event that was full of ill-advised experimentation, controversy, and even death. Got weird at these fairs. But I mean, historically, they would always have cool things happening at them. Like at one point, there was this giant robot named Electro that would smoke a cigarette, which is probably the coolest thing a robot can do. And even Pabst Blue Ribbon won their Blue Ribbon at a World's Fair. Now, I know what you're thinking, Tucker, that dog beer should never win an award, and I agree with you, but, you know, things were different back then. So let's examine all the weird and interesting points about the World's Fair throughout history together, and maybe have sex with a few robots along the way. There's no sex robots? There's never been a sex robot at the World's Fair? Then what are we doing? I thought, can we change? Is it too late to change the script?
Thousands are treading to get a fascinating preview of things to come.
So the first prototype of the World's Fair took place in Bohemia in 1791 for the coronation of Leopold II. Everything about that sentence I just said makes me feel like this is some poorly written historical fiction novel, but it's all true. Bohemia was a real place. It's now the Czech Republic, but Bohemia was not just a concept. It was a real country at one point. So Bohemia's proto-World's Fair, known at the time as Warren Cabinet, came years before the band Queen ever came around, but it still had a very impressive musical guest, Mozart. So if I can put the idea of how long ago this was in your head, Mozart was the headliner. His last opera, known as La Clemenza de Tito, debuted there. Wasn't he German? What was Mozart? That sounded Spanish. His name's Wolfgang Mozart, right? Yeah, he's Austrian. Is that Austrian? That sounded Spanish. Anyway, Mozart was commissioned to show up to the fair and please Bohemian royalty, as well as strengthen Leopold's empire against revolt. Because a lot of people at that time in history were revolting against their empires. Mostly because of the French. The French kind of showed everyone else that they don't have to put up with shit, and you gotta give it to them. I always talk shit about the French, but that was cool of them. They didn't have to do that. Apparently, they just beheaded King Louis the XVI, whatever number that is, in 1793. All the royalty in every country at that time didn't realize that if you didn't like the king or queen, you could just fucking kill them, and everyone would be cool about that. So Bohemia was trying to get ahead of that as best as possible. So did Mozart's opera, as well. You got it, you're in the lighting, baby. So did Mozart's opera, as well as the exhibitions full of textiles, jewelry, and mirrors, quell the unrest in the Holy Roman Empire? Kinda. It kinda worked. People didn't end up killing the King of Bohemia, but then Napoleon showed up in 1806, and that was pretty much the end of that empire. Which goes to show you that no matter how badly things are going, the French will always show up and make it worse. Speaking of which, let's move on to France. France is the next stop in this story. As I just explained, France was going through a lot of upheaval at the time, you know, rolling heads down the street like Mick Barry. Who the hell's Mick Barry? Why did I write that? But despite everything that was going on, the French still loved a good party. In 1798, they started a tradition of public industrial expositions meant to bolster national unity and display French innovation. You know, like cheese and not taking showers. I don't know why I'm so mean to the French. Can you get down? Oh, Jesus Christ. I don't think this is gonna work, Abby. I don't think this is gonna work. We're gonna have to... Good. There you go. Borrowing from the Bohemians, the first expo showcased a device that demonstrated the metric system, which was a relatively new invention at the time. But despite all of its promise, sadly, the world rejected the metric system, and we still use the imperial system to this day, according to my textbook. So after the first one, France decides to keep this tradition alive and has an expo every single year, and they seem to get better every single year. The 10th Industrial Expo in 1844 was a whole goddamn banger. Adolphe Sax, the inventor of the saxophone, showed off his new invention, the sax horn. And I have so many things I want to say about that. First of all, Adolphe Sax. Sorry, bro, that's probably the worst name I've ever heard in my life. Second of all, I didn't realize the saxophone was named after a person. And three, it's crazy that there was a time period in history where people were still making instruments. I feel like we take that for granted, but like instruments were still coming out. And then we also have Charles Xavier Thomas, not the dude from comic books, you fucking nerd. He can walk and he's French. He debuted the arithmometer, one of the first mechanical calculators ever created. So that's probably pretty important historically. They also debuted the daguerreotype, whatever. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it was the first photography technology that was open to the public.
Hey gang, quick note, for some reason when I record my videos, I can't pronounce the word photography. I've said it several times and I always end up saying photography like a country bumpkin. I am so embarrassed, but I'm not going to re-record that.
So in just 1 year alone, you could calculate just how much pussy you were going to get playing the sax horn while someone took a picture of you. Wild time. All told, there was 3,969 exhibits on display, and 3,253 of those exhibits got awards for their whatever they were doing, and that kind of ruins the point of an award. I think the French invented the participation trophy. But let's not forget about Britain. Britain historically does not like getting shown up by the French, so they're the next stop on our story. While Bohemia and France exposed themselves to the world using their expos, Britain flipped it on its head and invited the world to come to them with all their stuff, which I guess is very on brand for them. In 1851, Britain hosted the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. Terrible title. Terrible title, guys. Does the abbreviation look good? Gwewin? No, that's also terrible. You guys didn't even try. Anyway, to hold the event, they built a 1,000,000 square foot hall built with 60,000 panels of glass all around it. And they called it the Crystal Palace. Ooh. This sounds like a place that you would find in an Adventure Time episode, but no, it was a bunch of Brits going ham with the blueprints. Many historians consider the Great Exhibition to be the first World's Fair just because everyone was coming, so it was technically a World's Fair. So I guess I could have skipped everything I talked about before this point. God damn it, I cannot put a script together. But yeah, and literally everyone showed up for this thing. Nearly half of the 14,000 exhibitors were from other countries. Some of the modern technology that was shown off, and this is not a complete list, a primitive fax machine, an envelope folding machine, a machine that used leeches to measure barometric pressure. This one's a little less culturally significant, but they can't all be winners. In addition to inventors, some of the greatest minds of their time were there, like Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Charles Dickens, and Lewis Carroll. It's hard to comprehend how much world-changing brain power was in one room at one time. That seems to be a mistake, although the conversations were probably terrible. Like Karl Marx is over there talking about the abolition of private property, and, you know, Charles Darwin is waiting to talk about how fish grew legs. But by any metric, the Great Expedition was a wild success. Over 6 million people attended, and Britain made over 186,000 pounds, which in today's time money is a staggering 33 million pounds, and that's 42 million in American dollars, which is the most important kind of dollar. A good portion of the profits that came from this event were from pay toilets, something that was first shown off there, and something that Europeans still fuck with to this day. Over 675,000 people paid to pinch a loaf at the World's Fair, which is something I will never have to do. And as American, we have a lot of problems, but I'll never pay to shit. So I have that going for me. The success of the Great Exposition set the standard for all of the rest of the World's Fair. During the second half of the 19th century, tons of similar events took place in cities like New York, Munich, and Dublin. And since there's no ad this week, I'm just going to tell you about it. I don't have to pause and give thanks to somebody who's not paying for me. So if you could like and share the video and tell people about me so I can make some money, that'd be fantastic.
Arizona, the Union's youngest state, contributes to the Star-Spangled Congress of Achievement.
So the World's Fair's history is separated into 3 distinct eras, each one of them full of mad geniuses, visions of utopia, and propaganda, the 3 big hitters. Let's first discuss the era of industrialization, a segment of time that I'm sure God regrets. The industrialization era of the World's Fair lasted from 1800 to 1939. The defining aspect of this era was a focus on inventions, advancements, and trade. Kind of like you just started a new playthrough of Frostpunk, am I right, fellow virgins? A lot of world-changing inventions came about during this time, like vulcanized rubber, and those crazy moving pictures that the kids are all crazy about. Plastic was also shown off during this period, something that no one knew the ramifications of. Quick side note, I always think about like when I was a kid and I'd hear how my parents' generation was getting fucked up by lead paint chips and asbestos. I always thought, I wonder what the thing that's killing my generation is going to turn out to be, because I knew it was around, I just didn't know what it was. It was plastic. Now I have plastic in my balls. I just think that's interesting that it turned out to be that way. Anyway, during this era of World's Fairs, iconic landmarks were also built for them. For example, the Eiffel Tower. Parts of the Statue of Liberty were also displayed at the 1876 and the 1878 fairs before they shipped them off to America. Which, once again, sub-tangent, was that a normal thing to do back then? Like to gift another country a giant statue, a giant landmark? I feel like that was the one time that ever happened. The telephone was introduced by Alexander Graham Bell at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philly. Yes, there was a World's Fair in Philly. And knowing Philly, the phone and Alexander Graham Bell were probably booed off stage while people were hucking bricks up at them. The 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago showed off electricity for the first time. It was the first fair to ever be completely lit by electricity. It featured electric sewing machines, the first moving sidewalk, and the electric chair, which is wild. That's just so funny to me that we invented electricity and the second thought we had was, do you think they'll let us kill people with this? The undercurrent of the fair, pun intended, was a feud between Tesla and Edison. Historians call this feud the Current Wars. Tesla was a proponent of alternating current, electrical current that can change direction, and Edison was all about direct current, which only flowed one way. Edison and his company spent years before the fair trying to scare the public about the dangers of AC by electrifying and killing animals in public. Oh no, that's not good. Apparently, throughout their entire smear campaign, they zapped 44 dogs, 6 calves, and 2 horses. Just to make a point, I guess. And then after all that, Edison showed up at the World's Fair and showed off a light bulb. So, pretty cool, I guess. While Tesla showed up and demonstrated how an induction motor works by placing a copper egg into a rotating magnetic field so it could float. So kind of like local inventor versus evil magic wizard battle kind of thing. But even though Tesla seemed way cooler and wasn't killing animals, he still had his own dark streak. Right before he died, he was working on a technology that he deemed the Teleforce, also known as a death ray. It was a straight up death ray that he was building. Although never proven, he claimed it could shoot down an airplane from 250 miles away. So let me know down in the comments if you're on Team Tesla or Team Edison. Do you like killing animals or giant floating copper eggs? Up to you. Moving on, the next era of the World's Fair we will dub the Cultural Exchange. The World's Fair moved on to this era between 1939 and 1988. In 1939, New York's World Fair started the practice of focusing on sharing culture to promote a better future for society. In this time frame, technological innovations took a backseat to future forecasting. One exhibit was called Futurama. Hell yes, dude. Although it didn't have alcoholic robots or sexy one-eyed aliens, it did essentially predict the interstate highway system while also envisioning self-driving cars. Also at that same fair, the Westinghouse Electric Company created a 7.5-foot metal time capsule. And oh boy, am I a good little slut for a good old time capsule. I'm waiting on bated breath for them to open up that Nickelodeon time capsule, even though I'm sure it's full of Surge Soda and horrible Dan Schneider relics. But the weird thing about the Westinghouse Electric Company time capsule is that it's supposed to be open in 5,000 years, and I'll be honest, I don't think we're going to be around by then. But it's not much of a loss considering what's in the time capsule. There's a deck of cards, 2 different materials that contain asbestos, a pack of Camel cigarettes, and change. Like straight up pocket change. It's like some scientist forgot he had a deadline and just like took everything out of his pockets and threw it in the capsule. If someone is eventually around to open up this capsule in 6939, then they're just going to open up a very boring box of poison. But maybe the most futuristic part of this World's Fair was the fact that World War II broke out in the middle of it. Oops. Just a month and a half before the war began, Hitler took over Czechoslovakia, the country formerly known as Bohemia. Remember from earlier? Soon after the New York's World Fair opened up its gates, Germany took over Poland. So of course, the Czech pavilion never opened, and Poland draped a large black cloth over their pavilion after the invasion. Their absence was a reminder that a full world war had begun, which is sad. Super sad moment in this fair. Ironic considering that the New York World's Fair official pamphlet read, "The eyes of the fair are on the future, a view of forces and ideas that prevail as well as the machines." Which I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be more kumbaya than anything, but 6 years later, we would drop nukes on Japan. So, it's pretty chilling. By the time Seattle hosted the Century 21 Exposition in 1962, the power structure of the latter 20th century had been set. Tellingly, the Soviet Union did not have a pavilion at this World's Fair. And why do I always end up talking about the Soviets? Why do I always end up on the Cold War during these videos? This is like the 3rd one in a row. With the space race raging, Seattle definitely hosted a fair that had an eye on the future. But since it was 1962, they didn't understand that the future would be defined by LSD and a growing counterculture. They thought the vibe was going to be more the Jetsons and not BO jam bands and free love that the current decade would soon unveil. The iconic Space Needle in Seattle was unveiled for this event, which makes sense, but I always thought it was weird that Seattle had this giant weird fucking thing sticking out of its skyline when it's a pretty normal city besides that. And they also had an exhibit called The World of Tomorrow, which featured a ride called the Bubble-Lator and also showed you booths full of predictions, such as, in the future we will have 24-hour work weeks and a $12,000 annual salary. Double both of those numbers and you have a pretty accurate, super sad depiction of what we're all doing right now. But the real attraction at the Century 21 Expo was a little exhibit on the outskirts of the fair, and it was called Show Street. Show Street had a performance called Girls of the Galaxy, where young women would pose naked for visitors with cameras. Holy fuck, okay. And you know who would have loved Girls of the Galaxy? The horniest president we've ever had, John F. Kennedy. He was scheduled to come for the closing ceremony of the fair, but decided to decline using the excuse he had a cold, and in reality, he was dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which once again makes it obvious why the Soviets were not posting up in Seattle Aristotle. History was silly and we should regard it as such. And then we have the final era of World's Fairs, which we will call national branding. Starting in 1988, fairs circled back around to their roots to show off what they all got. This isn't to say that they stopped inviting other countries to participate, just that hosting a fair wasn't about the entire world and more about just putting on a very expensive PR stunt. I mean, I always thought it was weird that we were building giant structures like the Eiffel Tower and the Space Needle just for one fair. But in this era, they took that concept and inflated it like they were trying to keep an emergency raft afloat. Spain's Expo in 1992 essentially served as a coming out party for their new democratic government. Shanghai, China hosted Expo 2010 under the theme Better City, Better Life and coronated Shanghai as the next great world city. And Dubai's 2020 Expo was the first ever held in the Middle East, showcasing the wealth of the United Arab Emirates. So the world fairs are still around, they just lost their world-changing appeal. But nowadays, if we held another one in the US, I would love to show off what America's all about. AKA dangerous food, military power, and beautiful women of first-generation immigrants. God bless this country.
Little old New York shares the spotlight. And buxom belles, terpsichorean heavyweights strip the light fantastic with abandon. And great for reducing.
So I think it goes without saying, but when millions of dollars in multiple countries get involved, things tend to get weird. And I'm not just talking about Maiku, the mascot for the 2025 Expo. He's weird, but in a fun way. I'm talking about weird and horrible controversies that have been surrounding World's Fairs almost since the beginning. For example, there was a lot of death at World's Fairs, consistently. For example, businessman H.H. Holmes traveled to the 1893 Chicago's World's Fair to commit the most heinous crime of all, insurance fraud and murder. He was a prolific serial killer. Actually, Holmes is considered America's first serial killer. He built a small hotel on the Chicago World's Fair fairgrounds, and he would convince women who traveled to Chicago for work to stay at his hotel. And while they were there, he would murder them and throw them in the crematorium he had in his basement. You know, the hotel crematorium, a very normal thing for most hotels to have. There was also like staircases that went nowhere. It was laid out in a very specific way to confuse anyone who went into it. The press dubbed this hotel the Murder Castle, and before his execution, he admitted to murdering at least 27 women. So that's a good start to this segment. Oh, and also the mayor was assassinated during the World's Fair too. The Chicago mayor. Lots of death at the Chicago World's Fair. Not in the Chicago City. The Chicago City is really nice. After returning home from giving a speech at the World's Fair, Mayor Carter Harrison was shot 3 times at point-blank range by Patrick Eugene Pendergast. The assassin said he killed Harrison because he didn't give him a job as Chicago's corporate counsel, which makes sense because the assassin had literally no legal training at all, and he was just a crazy person looking for a job. I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask, but well, this time it did. It did hurt to ask. So this whole assassination thing and the H.H. Holmes thing, it all kind of ruined the mood. The fair's closing ceremony was canceled, and instead there was a public memorial service for the mayor there. So not very innovation forward, but we did get all these cool buildings out of it, so that's nice. Actually, looking at all these pictures, what the fuck happened to all this cool shit? This doesn't look like Chicago, this looks like Rome. I lived in Chicago for 8 years. Where did all this shit go? Oh, there's conspiracies about it. Okay, I'm not gonna get into that. But the murder of a Chicago mayor wasn't the only notable assassination that happened at a World's Fair. The craziest one came from the 1901 Pan American Expo in Buffalo, New York. President William McKinley was shot twice by an anarchic assassin. And that's very shocking to hear, mostly because I did not know we had a president named William McKinley. Who the fuck is that? But the good news is that the fair had electricity that was powered by the nearby Niagara Falls, and they had an operating room in the hospital that was built on the fairground. Bad news is that the operating room they sent him to did not have any electricity for some reason. The whole hospital was covered in light bulbs, but that one operating room did not have any. Instead, they used a metal pan to reflect sunlight into the operating room. But more good news, the fair featured some of the first X-ray technology, so they could have used that. But the bad news is there was a catch. X-ray technology doesn't work if you don't use it, and they didn't for some reason on the president. They didn't try and save the president properly. They could only find one bullet, so they dug that one out, which fucked him up considerably, and then they just left the other one in. And McKinley died from his wounds 8 days later. So a lot of ups and downs in this story. A lot of death in the World's Fair's lore. Still not convinced that man even existed, though. William McKinley? Who the fuck? But let's move away from the sad death stuff and move on to something a little bit lighter, like racism. God damn it. Obviously, the World's Fairs mostly happened in the past. The past was racist. The present is racist, but that shit was real racist back then. No one in their right mind would imagine a public gathering in the 1800s would be cool for everyone. No one would think that. This inequality was called out in the 1893 World's Fair with a pamphlet that read, "Theoretically open to all Americans, the exposition practically is, literally and figuratively, a white city." Oh God. "In the building of which the colored American was allowed no helping hand, and in its glorious success he has no share." Good Lord. And I'm sad I had to say colored American. I just said it again. But guess what? It gets worse. It gets demonstrably worse. The World's Fair has been racist in staggering ways to the point where I don't know if I can even talk about some of this shit without getting demonetized. It had things like human zoos And that phrase speaks for itself, and it speaks angry and bad. I'm not gonna go into this because it's so unbelievably fucked up. Pause the video now if you want to look at all this shit, but like I don't want to talk about it. Okay, moving on. What else happened at World's Fairs? You could win a baby in a raffle. You could win a baby. What the fuck? The 1909 Alaskan Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle decided to throw a raffle. You could win great gifts such as a free meal or a discount at a local shop or an entire human baby, a real-life human baby. The Washington Children's Home Society decided to raffle off this little guy. The 1-month-old baby was named Ernest and was the property of the Washington Children's Home Society. I guess in 1909 that meant you could do anything with a baby if you owned it properly. I don't know what's worse, the fact that Ernest was raffled off as a prize or the fact that someone won him and never came to collect him. Oh geez. Someone took Ernest home and there is no record of what happened to him after that day. But the World's Fair also helped popularize and display the world's first incubators, so that's good, keeping babies alive. Dr. Martin Cooney exhibited the incubators in action at the World's Exposition in Berlin in 1896. He displayed 6 premature babies in incubators in an exhibit called the Child Hatchery. We can only win so many battles here. And booyah, all 6 babies lived. Let's go. But also, maybe keep them in a hospital. Don't let people, like, press their noses up against the glass when a baby's just trying to survive. It's probably very stressful. Why are we putting them in a fair? This shit was weird top to bottom. I mean, there's so much more I could talk about. But World's Fairs still happen, even though their popularity in the West has waned. Hell, there's one next year with this freak. Maybe part of the reason why we've stopped caring about World's Fairs is because America is done establishing itself. A century ago, massive technological advancements like the internet, the iPhone, and god, even the Cybertruck would have been shown off at a World's Fair. Now innovations are sold directly to consumers at events that are split between a TED Talk and a church service. And yes, they still sell us products that are meant to improve our lives and our futures, but it's more about making money than it is bettering the society as a whole, which probably isn't good. Probably is bad. New videos every Saturday and Wednesday sometimes. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. My tooth is better. We did it, everybody.